and welcome to our Saturday session at Stay-On. We are honored to have our guest speaker this morning. And we would like to acknowledge the land we are on and thank the First Peoples of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nations and other Indigenous people for sharing this land with us. Our speaker this morning is Jean-Paul Restoul. Jean-Paul is a member of the Docus First Nation. He is Associate Professor of Aboriginal Education at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education of the University of Toronto. He has been a member of OIC's Indigenous Education Network since 1998 and was a co-chair of the network for 7 years. He co-founded SAGE Ontario, a peer support group for graduate students whose research involves Aboriginal communities, and is an original member of the OIC working group to infuse teacher education with Aboriginal perspectives called Deepening Knowledge, Enhancing Instruction. He has contributed to research on urban Aboriginal identity, HIV prevention messaging in Aboriginal communities, access to post-secondary education for Aboriginal people, and curriculum development with Aboriginal perspectives. It's a great honor for us to welcome Jean-Paul Restoul. Please join me in welcoming him.
Bonjour, Jean-Paul Restoul Nishikawas. Wajashka Dodem, Okinawa Nasinda Donji, Wishna Leandao, Wayne Doshi and Dao, Good morning. It's great to see so many people here on a Saturday morning. That's so sunny and beautiful, and you could be somewhere else, but you're here. So thank you for coming. And I just wanted to let you know, I introduced myself in the Ojibwe language, and I could see some faces thinking, oh God, he's not going to use Ojibwe for this whole talk, is he? Well, I'm not that fluent yet. I've been learning as an adult. It's not something not a language that was spoken in our home. And we grew up in what was then a small town of Orangeville, Ontario, and it's growing quite a lot. But my experience at that time in schooling, and that was very, very little to do with Indigenous issues, cultures, knowledge, or perspectives. Very scant to my schooling. And at home too, my father didn't exactly hide his identity, but he wasn't very open about it either. So it wasn't something that he hid, but I learned over the years about where he grew up and the context of the time and place where he was raised, and why you would choose to pass as white if you could. So that you could go to the restaurant and not be charged before your food arrived, so that you're not one of those dine and dash Indians, you know. So these kinds of things, I can see why he made these choices. Excuse me, I'm also talking to you, just recovering from this cough and cold, which the nice thing about kids going to school is you catch everything they bring home. And as teachers, I don't know how you do it. So I understood too that in his time and place there was this devaluing of Indigenous people, wisdom, knowledge, perspectives. And this kind of devaluing, although it starts in the realm of ideas and the abstract and intellect, it filters down and ends up influencing acts of discrimination. So it's important for us to look at the ways in which we model respect for Indigenous perspectives, wisdom, knowledge, and so forth. Getting back to my reading this morning, speaking in Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe language. But first, it's 10 words that I spoke, and they're long words. But it tells you my name, and it tells you my clan identity, then it tells you my community, and then my nation. So it's like these ever-expanding circles of relationship. So first I'm talking about my relation to spirit, then my relation to clan, who I'm related to, and then who are the members of my community, and then who are the members of the Anishinaabe Nation, everyone who speaks Ojibwe. So it gets bigger and bigger, these circles. But just in those 10 words, another Anishinaabe person who knows those communities, knows those clans, knows those names, knows what I'm saying, they get a sense of how they're related to me. And so much of what Indigenous ways of knowing is about is finding your relationship to something and going deeply into that relationship and figuring out what it's about. So I start that way so we can be thinking about how this kind of worldview that centers relationship and relationality can be a very different starting place than some of the key tenets of Western science and Western ways of knowing. But before we get there, there's a few things I want to do. So I just want to talk to you a little bit about why are we talking about Indigenous knowing and science education. And when I was invited to come here today, I was asked to just talk a little bit about what are some of the issues for First Nation students. Why might we be wanting to think about those things? And I think in the context of all the work that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has done in the past year or so that we've heard about their work in a very public way. I wanted to situate it in that. So when I think about that question of what are the issues for First Nation students, I think as teachers, it kind of makes us have to respond in two ways. And one is to think about those students in our classrooms who are First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. So we have to change the conditions in our classrooms, make them welcoming spaces for them. But at the same time, things aren't going to change unless we also change the minds of everyone else in that classroom too. So we're also thinking about the next generation of Canadian learners and ensuring that they come away with a respect for valuing Indigenous ways of knowing and being. And I think that actually means we're doing the same work for both groups. But what you find in a lot of the literature, and I don't know how much literature you need today, so I won't go too much into it, but there seems to be this kind of sort of bifocal approach where people like to talk just about the First Nation students. And what do they need? What do the First Nation students need? Or there's an approach on what do all people need to know about First Nations? The thing is, I think we can kind of address both by making the classroom a space that welcomes Indigenous knowledge as a positive contribution, and then we are addressing both by modeling that respect for this way of knowing. So today I just want to talk a bit about why we should consider the worldviews in the work that we do. I also want to touch on reconciliation and how that impacts what we do as teachers. And discuss some of the barriers to making those changes. And I'll share some resources as well, because, well, you'll see why. Anyway, I think there's at least 4 reasons why Indigenous worldviews matter. Probably many, many more, but how much time have you got? I'm going to start with 4. And maybe you're not convinced by some of them, so that's why I also try to give you multiple reasons, because if one doesn't land or stick, maybe a different approach does. So the first is to think about the demographic shifts that have been going on in Canada for some time, and to grapple with that. That's one reason. I'll get into that in a minute. The other is because of Canadian values, this notion that is so deeply held in Canada of upholding notions of social justice. It's another reason why we need to address what's gone on with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit in Canada over these years. I also want to mention that if we're not including Indigenous perspectives, how complete is our education? And that means our own education as instructors, but also the education that we're providing to the future generations in our classrooms. If they don't ever get any exposure to Indigenous perspectives, how is that education complete? And I also want to mention that some of the most pressing environmental challenges of our times, there are some perspectives from Indigenous ways of knowing. So I have IK up here, it's just Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous knowing. So from Indigenous ways of knowing, there are some insights for how we might live in a different way, how we might privilege certain ways of doing and being that could actually improve our chances of survival. So moving into that first reason, demographic shifts. I think for at least 20 years, maybe 30 years now, there's been an Aboriginal baby boom in Canada. And Aboriginal people are the youngest and the fastest growing segment of Canada's population. More than half of the Aboriginal people in Canada are under the age of 25. So we're going to see a lot of these faces in our classrooms, and maybe we already are, depending on where you work. It's important to know, too, that about a third of First Nation students are in provincial schools, and this is status Indians, okay? So there's non-status Indians and Aboriginal people who are not captured in these numbers, who are in our classrooms in urban settings and so on. In fact, there was a study done by People for Education, and they found 92% of elementary and 96% of secondary schools have Aboriginal students within them. So as someone who works at OISE, I sometimes hear from teachers, well, I'm not going to work on reserve, so I'm not going to have Aboriginal students. Well, the thing is, they're in every school just about. So we don't all look like the movie Native for Dances with Wolves. There's so much diversity to what an Indigenous person looks like that we may have Indigenous students in our classes and we don't know. So it's important that we are offering that opportunity for self-esteem by including this information in a relevant and affirming way. I also wanted to mention here, you see this stat about the lack of professional development for teachers. And this is something I hear fairly often, all across the country, not just in Ontario, that there's either no or little room for professional development vis-a-vis Indigenous knowledge or understanding how to support people from Indigenous cultural communities. And the other thing that is not caught in these stats as well is there's also frustration with the same material being brought up all the time. So if there is PD, it's often the same intro stuff over and over and over. People don't get an opportunity to deepen their knowledge and their application of this work. So again, data from EQAO and from People for Education identified every school board has at least some Aboriginal students, but depending on where you are in the province, it can be as high as 1 in 4 students in your school board, whereas in the GTA it's probably 2%. I think that's even an undercounting in the GTA, but it depends who's doing the counting and how they do it. It's a problem with self-identification as a methodology. Moving on to the other reason, and there's so much more we could have said about demographics. I guess the other thing to think about, let's go back to that one. You know what, I think I'll mention the labor shortage in a minute. Upholding social justice. So, all around the world, when we mention Canada, people are thinking it's synonymous with upholding human rights, and yet, when you look at their track record at home, Canada has done some really horrible things with Indigenous lands and peoples. So just going through this laundry list of the stats, which are just horrible. but I think probably not unfamiliar to you here. The life expectancy for Indigenous people is lower than the rest of Canada. Illness is more common. Family violence and alcohol abuse are also more common experiences for Indigenous people. The suicide rates among First Nations 5 times higher than for the rest of Canada, and among the Inuit 11 times higher, kind of leading the world. And there have been studies done that have shown that the housing in First Nations communities is often inadequate. The water and the sanitation systems too. So we probably heard about something like 1/3 of the reserves in Canada have a boil water advisory at some point in the last couple of years. Some have had them in place for many, many years. We also know that the unemployment rate is much higher among Aboriginal people. And we know that it's a disproportionate number of Indigenous people incarcerated. So the point of these stats is not to paint a negative picture, and kind of do the opposite of everything I was just saying, which is seeing the positive contributions of Indigenous knowledge. But it's to show and underline why it is that many people have been saying, from Cindy Blackstock to Justice Murray Sinclair, that the conditions that Indigenous people live in are the most pressing social justice issue in Canada today. And that's my larger point. Here's a startling stat. For a First Nation youth today, he's more likely to go to jail than to graduate from high school. And in case you're wondering what that rate is, it's about 1 in 3, a little bit more than 1 in 3 First Nations youth finish high school. Moving on to my next reason that worldviews matter. I keep thinking about whether you're receiving a complete education if you're completely ignoring Indigenous perspectives on that topic. Indigenous people have studied these things for many years. And while there isn't the same kind of written tradition, there is a really rich oral history where knowledge is passed down in a way that it's an empirical observation of the way things change in a system, in an ecological system. There's other ways too of knowing it, but in terms of what's closest to what we recognize as Western science, there are those traditions. And more this is getting recognized. If we think about like the work of World Wildlife Fund, say in the north, they have been incorporating Inuit knowledge into their tracking of the depletion of sea ice, and also the numbers, tracking the numbers of caribou and polar bear. So there is a working together that is happening. And if we're continuing to teach in a way that we're not understanding how to integrate Indigenous knowledge, then I feel like we are not providing our students with a full and complete investigation of any topic, or even a different perspective on a topic. I also want to mention, too, that Aboriginal people are underrepresented in this area as well. So many Indigenous people are underrepresented in the health sciences, in engineering and technology, other sciences. And a lot of that is they don't see a fit for them at really young ages. So in Aguasasne many years ago, they were trying to figure out how to keep their kids in the sciences and maths. And that was because they felt like we don't have enough doctors and nurses in the community. So where did we lose them? And it was as early as 10 years old. They started to turn away from the sciences. So they said, what do we need to do to make it relevant to them? And what they found is we got to teach all the stuff that they learned from Ontario curriculum, but grounded in Mohawk ways of knowing. But they couldn't do it in such a way that they wouldn't be able to talk to their neighbors, their Canadian neighbors. they have to have a language that they understand. So it became a way of teaching both side by side, parallel. So from grades 6 to 8, and the culturally integrated curriculum, that's what it's called now, is still there at Akwesasne. And it's a really shining example of how to do this work. It's a two-eyed seeing, two ways of seeing the world. And at times they contradict, but they also have a unit on dealing with contradiction. Anyway, that was an attempt to try and bring Indigenous people into those fields. And I also want to talk about another reason these worldviews matter is the ecological challenges we're facing today. That Indigenous knowledge being linked so closely to sustainability and use of resources in a wise manner can help us look at other ways of how we approach and value things like forests, things like watersheds. And seeing some of these key battlegrounds in the last few years where Indigenous people have been the ones to stand up for lands, waters, and natural resources, understanding what's behind that desire to protect the natural world that we relate to. It's so hard to talk about this sometimes, because it still thingifies those beings. Understanding what's behind that approach, that understanding, that need to protect, can help us think about things in a different way. This is basically saying the same things. So, moving along, why does all this matter in terms of reconciliation? Well, last year, 2015, in June, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission issued their 94 calls to action to Canadians. And then they issued their full report about the residential school experience in December of that year. And it's been incredible, the traction that this document has had and the work of the TRC has had compared to many other efforts to bring Indigenous experiences to the awareness of Canadians. I feel like this has caught on in a way that many other places haven't. And something Justice Murray Sinclair said that I found struck me. And he said that this is not an Indigenous story, it's a Canadian story. And so I think by calling on Canadians to think about these issues and seeing the way that various institutions and governing bodies and organizations for teachers have said, we need to respond. And I think that's probably why I'm here today too, is asked to come here to get us thinking about these things. We have to think, what is the role of science in all of this? What is the role of teaching science? And I feel like it's about introducing ethical considerations when we're doing science. We like to think sometimes about science as being bias-free or neutral, or that's the beauty of it. You just look at the facts. But it comes from a perspective. It comes from a way of seeing. And we have to remember that too. And some of the work of the TRC reminded us of this. As educators, we have this responsibility to our learners because education is a reproduction of our society. We're trying to establish what is important to know in our society. We do this through the curriculum that we choose, we do it through the way that we teach, we do it through the subjects that we teach. We say, this is important to know. Well, when it comes to the work of the TRC and what happened in residential schools, a lot of it was done in the name of science. They became labs sometimes for experiments on Indigenous people, essentially as guinea pigs. And there was this notion of cultural superiority that allowed this to happen. And this is not to say that it's continuing in the same way today, but if it could happen again. Like if it could happen before, it can happen again. So we need to learn from the past to not make those mistakes again. And someone had said during the TRC things that if the school administration had been Indigenous, they wouldn't even have allowed such experiments to take place. And they would not have had such experiments considered, I would say, at all. I was going to say even to the point of carrying it out. If a health researcher was Indigenous, they just would not do this to their kids. So if we come to terms with the harms that can be done in the name of science, it's also a way that we as science teachers can support the efforts of reconciliation. And what does reconciliation mean? I haven't even defined it yet. But it's about restoring balance in relationships. We might say that those relationships might not have ever been balanced. I think they might have been the early, this part of contact period, but it's not about going back to the past. It's about maintaining a state of mutual respect going forward. So in that way, it's not an event. It's a process. Or if my daughter were here, she'd say, it's process, Dad. Process, whatever. It's something that's ongoing. So, what are some of the ways that as science teachers we can support reconciliation? And again, coming back to that notion of mutual respect. Trying to include more of those First Nation students, Métis students, Inuit students in participating in science. And that means changing some of the ways that we do it so that it seems relevant to them. And I know you hear this all the time, especially if you're a high school teacher, right? What does this have to do with my life? Well, whenever we can connect things to people's daily existence and make it really come alive for them, that's when we really ignite the sparkle. As this book here by Gregory Kahete, Igniting the Sparkle. He says, you have to get that feeling of connection to what you're learning. So he starts with art. He has children, and any age really, connect with what they want to learn about through drawing it, painting it, sculpting it, and then going deeper into it. Like, why do you think leaves grow that way? Why do you think a tree grows in this climate? And starting with those questions and going deeper and deeper, and then starting to see what are the natural principles behind those things. Okay, I mentioned the underrepresentation already. And I meant to hold my discussion of Anglo-Saxon until this slide, but I got excited earlier. So the question is, how do we do this? How do we ignite the sparkle? How do we get our First Nations kids, and kids who aren't from First Nations but could benefit from these ways of knowing, how do we get them to learn about it? How do we make that space more conducive? I think there's probably a number of concerns we have here in this room about our own abilities to do it. And so I want to actually take a moment to ask you to talk to your partner, someone sitting next to you. What are some of the barriers you think exist to taking on this work? And it doesn't have to be what you personally feel, but what you might think would be a barrier. And I want to see if you come up with some of the ones I did. So take about 30 seconds to do that. cut you off now, because I do want to have time for questions later. So anyone who feels comfortable just shouting out one of those barriers? Yeah.
Fear of accidentally causing offense by
Yeah.
getting it wrong.
Definitely, yeah.
Continually taking from the Indigenous community, like how many times can a speaker come to your class with all of the classrooms to get an authentic experience?
Okay, so maybe like putting a burden on the community or lack of reciprocity. Someone over there? No, you're all too shy. Okay.
We talked about cultural appropriation and
Yeah.
making sure that we do it right.
Okay, cultural appropriation, doing it right, fear of getting it wrong. I'm just going to repeat it in case people over there couldn't hear it. Yeah.
I can see people saying, oh, it's another thing we
Yeah.
have to do.
So where do I fit this when I have so much to do already? Yeah.
Fear of taking kids into more naturalized environments where they could observe nature.
Fear of taking them into
Concerns
natural?
about safety and
Safety.
lack of
Yeah.
access.
So yeah, okay. Getting out of the classroom can be risky.
It wasn't my idea, but it was my partner's that she said, what is it that you said? Putting it on the spot.
I just thought that if we do a better job of educating the educators, then we can reach the kids.
Okay, so more PD, I guess, for educators that's meaningful and gives them the confidence to do what they want to do for the kids. Yeah.
Now I'm gonna put my input there. I would love to have more direct interaction.
Yes.
Okay, I was born in Central America. My grandmother looked like an indigenous person. In fact, she has Mayan background, so I'm mixed. I came to Canada and I left because the indigenous people were being massacred, basically, just to take away their lands and their resources. Then I thought, well, I came to Canada to be safe. And then I realized that there are similar issues going on, but they were always hidden underground. But I'm glad that they're coming out in the open so we can avoid any such clashes or violent struggles that happen in many parts of the world. So, and I think as educators, we need to be aware, and I would love to interact with more indigenous people, which I can have no opportunity in Mississauga or in Toronto.
Well, thanks for bringing that up, because I do see remarkable parallels. And you may say it's a difference of degree, but where there's the state violence against Mayan people there and disappearing at the end of a gun, you come here and Indigenous kids are disappearing at the end of policy. So there's a pen that's doing the damage here, and it's still state violence against Indigenous people. Anyway, I want to get to some of these barriers. So I didn't actually hear it's not relevant, but maybe that's part of that. There's not enough time. So if I got to make choices, I'm going to leave out that Indigenous stuff. Lack of knowledge, so the need for that development. The fear of misrepresentation or offending. I feel like Karnak here is predicting what you guys would say. Not enough time to fit everything in, right? And lack of resources. Whether that's like teaching resources or people who are knowledgeable enough to come and do that work. So human resources as well as curriculum and so on. So like in terms of it's not relevant, this is something I've heard where people say, I don't know where to begin because the worldview and the knowledge seem so different. And sometimes that can be a lesson in itself. Just to go through some of the starting assumptions. And there's this interesting table, I've only taken a few points from it, but it was originally in a book called Wisdom of the Elders by Peter Newston and David Suzuki. And then they adapted it in Alaska, Oscar Quadley and Ray Barnhart for their Alaskan Principles of Indigenous Knowledge. I know there's a little bit of oversimplification here, but you can kind of see there's a very different starting point or assumption about the world between Indigenous and Western. So we have this idea that the universe is constantly changing. It changes the natural state of things versus this idea of physical objects that we can study. Now, you might say, well, science doesn't see it that simply. But, more or less, I think people from these traditions have this kind of way of thinking about things. A lot of it has to do with language, too. Indigenous language is so much about building on verbs. So things are always doing things. Motion is such a part of things. This next point, the holism versus reductionism. So scientific knowledge often advances by pulling things apart, reducing things to study the variables. In Indigenous ways, we're usually looking at the whole system and trying to understand how parts within it work in relation to the whole. This notion of time as cyclical from Indigenous worldview is very different than a notion of time as linear, and that things are progressing all the time. And it's really hard to, I know I have such limited time right now, so I don't want to get too much into this, but that's a really, really key one. Especially when we think about development and the assumptions that Indigenous people have to develop on the same path as Western peoples have. And then the human role. There's so many other points to this chart. I encourage you to look for it. Good old Google. So in terms of this other objection or barrier to doing this work, which is, I don't have the knowledge. I can't do it. A couple suggestions. One is to kind of use this notion of inquiry-based learning and be a co-learner with your students. And it takes some courage and vulnerability to do that. Maybe some of you already do that. But I know some people are really concerned with giving up that authority, that power, the all-knowing teacher. And some students look to their teacher to be that way. So it can kind of disrupt that expectation as well, but it can be very fruitful, especially if you really aren't learning this stuff. So I'll point out another resource, which some of you might know about, Natural Curiosity. So the second edition, I don't know if it's out yet, but there's many, many more Indigenous examples and integration coming in version 2.0. So Natural Curiosity, this is inquiry-based activities for learning about environmental education. So I also have here develop relationships in order to build capacity. What I mean by that is developing relationships with Indigenous communities and people. And there is that concern, which is raised over here, that you might pull on people too much. Like you have the same person come all the time and you're drained on their thing. But the more time you spend with them, not just in a professional capacity, but in a personal capacity, you can run things by them and they can advise you, and you're not asking them to be in your classroom. You can kind of be, what I want to try? I want to try this. And they might say, no, you should not do that. But they might say, no, that's a good idea. And here's something else you can try. So I know, how realistic is that? Well, it does take time. So we also have to be thinking about this as a long-term journey of learning too. Not something that's just going to happen overnight. But if we develop these relationships, they can help us do this work. Finding resources and learning along the way. So that's part of that, but it's also knowing that there's no perfect resource. That every resource has a limitation to it. And so if we put off things because we're always looking for the exact perfect thing to do, we'll never get started. So we kind of have to work with the limitations and make that part of our teaching as well. Say, what's missing from this? And let your students in on that. So kind of have this very statement right here. I'm afraid of getting it wrong. I don't want to offend. And that kind of analysis paralysis prevents some of the best teachers from doing anything. But the thing is, if we just keep doing the status quo, that's getting it wrong too. So I encourage you to try something out. The important thing is to learn from the mistakes when they happen. Because if we go in wanting to not make a mistake, and when we're working with these messy kind of ideas and approaches, things are going to happen. But the thing is to learn from it and figure out, what will I do next time? And there's always time to fix those things. And the important thing too is intent. Your spirit and intent behind your action speaks really loudly. And I think that if you're able to say, I wasn't trying to do that, I'm sorry I offended, this is what I was trying to do, and correct it, make adjustments, that's how these things continually improve. And the relationships are a good check on that. If you have relationships with Indigenous people and communities, and there's going to be differing perspectives on things. You can talk to, just say, the 6 Indigenous faculty at Boise will all have a different opinion about something. We might be remarkably in agreement and consensus on some things, but there might be other things where I'll say, go ahead and do this, and Sandra Stires will say, don't you ever do that. How do you reconcile these things? Well, that's all part of this. It's complex and messy. There isn't one Indigenous perspective. There's many. I do recommend bringing in guests, but like was stated here, you do have to be careful not to draw too much on them. I used to do these talks all the time, and I would say, go to your local friendship center. They usually have elders, bring in the elders, and I thought, wait a minute, if I give this talk to 6 rooms of 200 people and they all do that, that person's booked for the next 3 years if all of you make that phone call. So we do have to be careful about what we ask and how we develop those relationships. I have down here know the protocols, and that's hard to get to know as well. But usually, if you're having to ask, is this something I should do? Then perhaps you're not ready. And that's the answer I've given because when I'm teaching in my classroom, I usually begin with a smudging ceremony. And it really changes the dynamic of the group. It relaxes everyone, prepares us for talking about some difficult things. And maybe by the 6th or 7th week, other people in that room who've only been introduced to the ceremony in that course are saying, I'd like to do that with my class, with my students. And they ask me for permission to do it. And I think if you're asking me for permission, it means you don't have the teachings yet. So there's certain things like that where there's certain cultural things that maybe you don't take up. But there's many, many other things you can do. So it's about figuring out where those lines are. And I know that can be scary, but it's worth getting into. This notion of there's not enough time. My God, I'm feeling it right now. There's kind of 2 kinds, so there's more, but at least 2. It's your own time to learn the stuff yourself, right? It's like, I don't have time to learn all this stuff. That's where you have to kind of give yourself permission to go on a lifelong journey of learning this stuff. And even the elders will say, I only know a little bit about this. And they're in their 90s and they're saying, you only know a little bit about this? What does that mean for me? But there is so much to know. So we can be okay with not knowing at all. And the other thing is that the demands of curriculum, and I have to meet all these provincial expectations, I've got to put all that in there. You can't cram more in. I think sometimes one of the things to do, I wish I had more time to talk about this, but there's ways of working backwards and saying, we're going to do this project, and I have faith. I'm going to meet all those provincial expectations because you can't do this project and not hit all those things. And I'm thinking particularly of a grade 11 science class that was taught in Sioux Lookout by Darren Leonard. He came to talk to us about it at Boise one time. But they made a canoe. And so they brought elders in, told them which materials do you work with, how do you make the frame, how do you cover it, all this stuff. And the incredible thing is when he worked backwards and said, did we cover off this expectation? He could just tick them all off. We did them all. But I didn't teach to it. It's more that I trusted this project will deliver. And many other things have worked for him as well. Snowshoes, moccasins. So they did other kinds of cultural things. And in learning how to make them, they covered off all the science expectations. And many other really human ones too. It's incredible. Okay, so I don't know where to find resources. I brought a few here that I really like. So I've already shown you the Kaheti and the natural curiosity. Showed you igniting the sparkle. I don't know why Greg Kaheti goes with these presses that are so hard to find his things. So I do apologize. If you go online and you look for native science, well, this one you might find. But if you look for his other works, you might find them like used for $200. Like, how reasonable is that? But he goes with these presses and they run out. Sometimes it's best to call him and say, do you have any boxes in your basement? And he might. But this is a good one, native science. And these ones are really good. I don't know if you guys have seen these because they're a little old, but they're kind of timeless. They really work well because they're story-based and they work from traditional stories with extensions to projects in just about every science category. Like you can talk astronomy and biology and all kinds of things. And there's a whole Keepers series. So this is Keepers of the Earth. But there's also Keepers of the Animals. This is the teacher's guide. There's Keepers of the Night. This is Michael Caduto and Joseph Bruchon. So these are really great. So there's the whole book. But they also come with teacher's guides if you can find them. A little bit older, but they're out there. Glenn Aikenhead I have on the slide here. And Tom Alco's, if you can find his stuff. It's really, really interesting. And then I put the Greater Victoria School District. And if you Google this, that some of their things are online. Others you might have to get them from the school district. But they have put together some really interesting things. Now they're mostly BC specific, but there's some really good examples of how to connect story to teaching and learning scientific principles. Now I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to skip through some of these other ideas for things you can do. And just want to start just like closing, I want to say that the way we do the work is as important as the work we do. So we approach this, as we say in Anishinaabe, in a good way. That means with pure heart and intention. That we're trying to do the right thing as we do it. Then good things should come of that. And we've got to start from where we are now. We can't wait until that moment where, now I know enough. It's like, start now from what you know. And give yourself permission to learn over a longer period of time. Have you learn from doing as well. So if we don't do anything, we're not going to learn as much as if we try something out and learn from that. So permit yourself to dive in. Try this out. I know there's a lot of things where you go, I'm not really sure, but if you just say, I'm just going to do it, it's amazing what happens. You might have a lot of fun too. And it's good to admit to others your limitations too. And say, I'm not really sure about this, but I'm going to try it and I'm going to learn while I'm doing it. And along the way, you can ask for help. You can ask people who know something a little bit more about this and say, I'm still learning about this. What have you done? What can I learn from you? You've tried this. So it's important to kind of build the networks too and learn from other educators. And also the mistakes. Anticipate there will be mistakes, but learn from them. One time I had a student who came up and he said, Jean-Paul told me, make mistakes. It's like, that's not quite what I said. It's learn from the mistakes that you're going to make. So the relationship then, and the important thing about these relationships is they help support you as you're doing this work. And they're also a check on what you're doing. So when that person says, don't do that, it's good to have that relationship so they stop you before you make the mistake. Take some time to be proud that you're trying to do something, but be humble about what you're achieving. Humility is very important. And always, always, always think about the world you want your children to inherit. And what are you doing now to make that world happen? Right? Chimabrach. Thank you. I'm right up at 10, but I don't know if we have time for a question or two. Is that okay? Couple questions? Some of you have other sessions to get to. Oh, I forgot to plug. I think it was Meg O'Mahony is doing kind of follow-up on how to turn this and translate this into doing in the classroom. So I do encourage you to try that out if it's something you want to do. or hands? No? Okay. Jimmy West, thank you. You can always reach me at my email at your truck. Thank you.
I want to thank Jean-Paul so much for coming. It was marvelous. We learned from his passion and from his insights. He gave us inspiration to start now. I love that. To start now, right? That was great. And resources to do so. So that was marvelous. Thank you so much, Jean-Paul. I'd like to also remind you of some other exciting offerings this morning. At 10:15 in this area right here, we have Catherine Hayhoe speaking on climate change. What is happening and how do we know? Catherine is an internationally known climate scientist who has spoken in the Paris Summit and done a lot of extensive work worldwide. At 11:30 we have Brian Aspinall's talk.